All right, well, welcome to our Office of Indian Education PD Professional Development New Grantee Orientation. We're very excited to welcome all of you and kind of give you a walk through your new grant award. So as we get started, if you have questions as we're going through, we want to make sure that you get your questions answered. So please pop those in the chat box. If you are not familiar with where the chat box is located in Zoom, if you take a peek at the bottom of your screen, you should see two little talk bubbles. If you click on that, it will open up your chat box, and that's where you can type questions in, and we'll be able to get to those as we go throughout. If you're joining from a mobile device, you may need to swipe over from right to left, and that will often take you to the chat box as well. If you have any technical issues as you're going along, feel free to pop that in the chat box as well, and one of us from the TA team will reach out and help you. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to your program officer, Angela Hernandez.
Thank you. And it's so wonderful to see your faces, your names, and to be able to talk about your new award. Yay! It's been really hard to keep quiet, guys. So I'm glad to see you all here and really excited that we get to continue this work together. And I also, of course, want to welcome a few new faces and folks to the program. So again, my name is Angela Hernandez, and I serve as the Education Program Specialist and sort of support the Professional Development Program. And I'm here today with my leadership in the Office of Indian Education that I'll introduce shortly. Let's go to the next slide, please. So I'll just preface here as you guys are joining, just to mention that we will share out this slide deck afterward. So don't feel the need to, take down a flurry of notes. This will be shared. This is just a nice visual, a quick snapshot, so you all can see where everybody is. We still have, just as a point of information, 20 grants from the FY18 cohort. Many of you are the same for our FY21 cohort. And as you can see, we're in the places you'd expect us to be. So again, really excited to have you guys continuing and expanding the work. Next slide, please. So we had two absolute priorities, as you know. The first for teacher training, which is where the majority of you applied and received awards to support teacher recruitment, retention, and placement, as well as induction services. I'll just call out, well, many of you all see the familiar faces from our last couple of cohorts. I do want to call out St. Cloud State University. Congratulations, St. Cloud, and welcome. And Cicado Community Development Corporation from California, in partnership, I know, with Claremont, who is a previous and current grantee as well, and new grantee. Next slide, please. We have the new administrator training grantees. So this was actually interesting. We certainly had a few more administrator training grants this year than in years past. Not surprisingly, as you guys have worked and developed ways to expand the types of support and the types of training that you offer, and really thinking about how it sort of organically expands into administrator training, we certainly have more people doing this work now as well. And I also, under this particular priority, I want to welcome our friends from Blue Lake Rancheria in California. And again, congratulate you guys on the award, because I know you're sort of first time for administrator training grants. Next slide. So the continued kudos throughout, but just to talk about what we're going to talk about today, I'm going to give a quick overview of the program. We're going to talk in a little more detail about the grant award letter that I hope you've had a chance to review. So when I talk through some of these things, it'll be a review for you. And then just some highlights of fiscal practices. And then we're going to talk about some TA resources toward the end of the event today. Next slide. So for those of you who are new to the department or at least new in your role, maybe, even if your grant is not new. The Office of Indian Education supports both formula under Title VI of the ESEA and discretionary grants. A slew of discretionary grants, which in addition to the Professional Development Grant Program, we have the Native American Language Grant Program, what we call the Demonstration Grant Program, sometimes called by different names depending on the priority of a given year. So you've heard it referred to as Native Youth Communities Projects grants or ACE grants. And then this year we have our STEP grants, our State Tribal Education Partnership grants, as well as a new grant competition that I know Donna will make reference to in a moment, my boss and group leader for this particular year under the America Rescue Plan Act. Next slide, please. We don't do this work in a vacuum. We do it with a lot of support. And some of this, major support that we get in the way of technical assistance for all of our discretionary grant programs is through the TA team that we contract through Synergy Enterprises. So this is just a nice quick snapshot of our colleagues, and Sarah started us off today, and you'll be seeing a lot of her, as well as Kathleen and Olani, Tracy, and I know we have others on the call, I think today. Sarah, I don't know if you want to introduce them briefly or they want to introduce themselves.
Yeah, I think you hit everybody on the call today with the exception of Sarah Whitehead as well, who you often see kind of behind the scenes in the webinars and emails and things.
Great, thank you. Next slide, please. So we'll get into this detail again for those of you who are new. We have to be able to track all of the wonderful people in the way of participants that you train and to whom you provide a training benefit under what we call the Professional Development Program Data Collection System. So it's its own data system independent of the other systems that we'll talk about that you'll interact with at the department. And that system is managed by a second contractor, our support from ANLAR and Westat companies. And Karen, I think we have you on today, and just if you want to wave, Karen, and I want to thank you for being on. Karen is our guru, our expert on the data collection system, and our go-to for a lot of technical as well as policy support. She and I work together pretty closely with respect to tracking service payback obligation for your participants. Next slide, please. So before I go into some of the nitty-gritty of the grants, I want to turn it over to our leadership at OIE, our program director, Julian Guerrero. Julian?
Thank you, Angela. I appreciate that a lot. And, again, just want to echo the comments that Angela just mentioned, but just say, again, congratulations on becoming a PD grantee this year. And we're so excited to have you join us, join our community, be a part of the family. I saw some familiar faces, welcome back, and some new faces, welcome to the family. And, just real briefly in my native tongue, I just want to say shortly, Ha Maroeka Naniatsa Yani Suara Mohatsi. My name is Julian Guerrero Jr. I'm Comanche in Kiowa, and I have the incredible privilege of serving as the director of the Office of Indian Education, almost going on a year now. It's hard to believe time flies when you're in this position, a part of this office. I just want to say that, this dedicated group of professionals joining you today who are leading the charge on making sure that these grants are awarded are the program officers, the group leaders, the contractors who work day in and day out, some late hours, some early mornings to make sure that the paperwork is done and that things happen that need to happen in order to ensure your success as a grant project. We have grant projects all over the country: Arizona, California, Idaho, Minnesota, Montana, Nebraska, North Carolina, North Dakota, Oklahoma, Oregon, South Dakota, and Wisconsin. And that just is definitely warming to me to know that we have an incredible geographic diversity in this cohort. And I just also want to ground us in the work in front of us right now, because this is a moment of celebration for each of us as grantees. But now we have to look at the mountain in front of us, and that Indian country needs and deserves more Native teachers, more Native administrators throughout it. Each of your grant projects gets us 1 inch closer to that vision and goal of more representation in Native education. Representation matters. And I'll say that once more. Representation matters at all levels of public education. The more Native educators that we can get into classrooms, get into school districts, get into administrative positions, the stronger we become as a community. And that's the vision of the OIE, to support such community. And our collective voice is essential to ensure that you as a grant community feel heard, supported, aided, and overall ensure your success. And that's the mission of our program office. Your success as a grantee and as a grant project is our success as an Office of Indian Education. So we are all together missioned with one focus: to move that mountain, to take one step closer to making sure that we can make a dent in what needs to happen for Indian education. It needs to happen now. Supporting that representation and voice is, it's so powerful, and it's something that each and every one of our OIE team members are dedicated to. And again, I just have the special privilege to serve in this position. I am just one person, but we are all together such a powerful force to make sure that this community, these students, are supported and trained to become professionals in the areas of Indian education, whether that be teachers, administrators, etc. So again, just wanted to remind folks of the biggest mission of all is to make sure that Native students are supported, that they're represented, and that we ensure your success as grants. So thank you so much. And I give it back over to, is it Donna, Angela?
Yes.
Okay, to Donna.
Great. Thank you so much. And again, congratulations. Welcome to the family. This is always an extremely fun part of the job, is to welcome with open arms our new set of cohort and professional development. Some of you have heard this from me before. I used to work at OIE many years ago, and professional development was around back then. It's been a very successful program, and this was kind of my baby. And so I have a special little tuck in my heart for this program, and to see where it was then and to see where it is now. And with Angela leading the charge, it's just phenomenal. And to see how great the wonderful pictures I've seen coming in and hearing about all the great things that this program is doing overall, it's just amazing. And so you are in good hands. For those of you who are new to OIE, you've got some well-versed partners in here. And so we are all here together. So again, you have lots of resources at your fingertips. Welcome. To go forward, if you were to take OIE grant programs and slice it, it would essentially go into 3 different parts. There's the Title VI formula grants that Angela alluded to earlier. And then we have our discretionary grants, including the demonstration grants, the Native American language, this professional development, the state tribal education partnerships, and the new ARP, American Rescue Plan funds. And then the third piece is national activities. And this looks at procurement of contracts that help, such as funding our NACI, tribal consultations, the Native American Indian study that was just published a couple months ago, months ago. And we do fund that. And it helps with consultations and contracts and data collections. And of course, pays for this wonderful, awesome technical assistance provided for you today. So that's a nutshell of the OIE program. Next slide, please. And taking a look at the FY21, you joined some good people here. We have, of course, the professional development grants, and you can see a total of 10.18 million was obligated to fund your programs. We will also have a STEP grant competition coming soon, and we're expecting about 4 with a $1.3 million amount. And we were given $20 million. OIE was given $20 million with the American Rescue Plan funds. And with that, we have developed a program called the American Indian Resilience in Education Program, otherwise referred to as ARP-AIR, you may hear. The NIA is currently published out there. So if you know some people who would benefit from the program, looks at priorities that you can go, it's very wide range for tribal education agencies. And so take a look at that NIA, it's in grants.gov, do a research or a search term of resilience, American Indian, so forth. It'll take you right to it. It's open until September 13th. So if you know some tribal education agencies who may not have heard of that, it's out there. But lots of wonderful things coming through OIE forthcoming. And not to mention the new grants, we also have, of course, what they call continuation grants with our demonstration 2018 PD cohort and our 2020 NAL cohort. And they continue to be funded as well. So lots of good things going. Next slide, please. I'm going to turn it back over to Angela, and she can take you through that wonderful document known as the GAN.
Thanks, Donna. Before I get started, I did want to share just a couple of points and give you all just some perspective on the types of projects and the nature of the projects and how, in my opinion, I've observed some changes, which I think are really great changes based on the applications that you submitted and were approved. I think one key change that I saw across your grants in general was definitely far more thoughtfulness and deliberation around partners, who your partners are, how you're leveraging those partnerships and resources to support the successful outcomes of your participants. That was really critical. And I saw really thoughtful consortium agreements, really, clear expectations for what you and your partners should be doing to work together to coordinate the grant activities. And just that shared, again, collective responsibility to make sure that you meet the expectations and the requirements that you've set forth in your own approved scopes of work, respectively. So I just really want to give a kudos to you guys for really taking to heart what I think were important regulatory changes. So you guys know, it's a new day in terms of the types of qualifying schools and LEAs that people need to go into. And I think that's, you're going to hear that message over and over again, not because you need to hear it only and that's it, but you need to hear it and make sure that same messaging and consistency and frequency gets conveyed to your participants so that they are clear in the understanding of what they are going to ultimately be responsible and accountable for. I think you guys have done a great job of that. And again, we'll talk through in some more detail some of those nuances over the next year. For those of you, again, who are new to PD and to any of our grants here in OIE, you'll know that, and you'll see coming soon, and we're going to talk about it at the end of the session, there will be monthly sessions, and they're informal technical assistance sessions. They're hour-long. And it's really an opportunity for you to be able to ask some of these basic questions about project implementation, challenges you're coming up with. And I would argue it's a safe space for you to be able to ask questions and not just get answers from me or from other staff of the department, but really to problem solve collectively with your peers in this network. And so really the TA opportunities that we offer, we're excited about what the capacity and the resources that Synergy brings, but I'm also excited because they also provide the space for you guys to leverage each other's expertise and experience and knowledge and learning. So that is an expectation throughout when we have these talking circle events, when we have any type of opportunity for you to be communicating with one another. And it doesn't have to be facilitated by us, of course. I know that there are plenty of other ways that you guys interface and other times in other, environments and conditions. But I just want you to keep that in mind, that your partners are not just those on your consortium agreement, not just the department, but also your colleagues on the line today. So just bear that in mind as you move forward with the work. So let's talk a little bit about the GAN. I want to go to the next slide for us. Thank you. This is all stuff I know you all are familiar with. You should see my name there, Angela Hernandez, as your program officer with my contact information. We are still remote as department staff for the most part. So the short story is that email is typically the best way, or Microsoft Teams is the primary platform for the department. So you guys probably already saw, for the many of you who've already, thank you, have scheduled your one-on-one calls, that the platform that I will always use to communicate with you will be Microsoft Teams. I know that there might be some of you where that's not such a friendly platform. And if you want to use Zoom, that's certainly an option, but just so that I want to share this now, just a technical issue. If you want to use Zoom, it will need to be you, as we coordinate, who initiates the meeting. I can join the meeting, but I can't initiate the Zoom meeting from our government furnished equipment. So just those fun nuances, but I'm just throwing that out there for now. Tomorrow it could change. Your PR award number, that's super important, and maybe even more important now that I have not only 20 grants, but 49 grants to manage. So whenever you communicate with me by email or even in a voicemail, leave your PR award number. Always cite that. That's really important for me to be able to access quickly and easily the information specific to your question or issues. And the recipient project director. So making sure you see correct name and spelling of the person who you have named as the PD on record for your grant, the contact information, making sure that's correct. And the level of effort under block 5, that key personnel, making sure that the time, the FTE is correct. So double check those items, make sure that they look right to you. What you do not see, of course, on the GAN necessarily is who is your authorizing representative. They would have gotten an email when you guys were issued the GAN. So anytime there's a new admin action, and by action, I'm looking at block 2. You see under your PR award number, there's an action number. That's the number of the GAN. That's how you can keep track of how many GANs you've received, is that action number. So those action numbers cite how many have been issued. They always get issued to the project director and the authorizing rep. So if those change, please let me know, and I'm going to give you a little more detail about how to make those changes in a minute. Next slide. So here was the fun part. Right after we issued the award, we realized that you had the wrong start date, if you will, the wrong project period start date. If you look at GAN Action 1, you had, like, I want to say July 1st, maybe, or something. So I went in over Tuesday. I believe they were all completed on Tuesday. But you should now have a second GAN already at a minimum, which shares the correct dates. Let's go to the next slide. So your block period, your block 6, and your budget period and performance period dates should look like this. Okay, so if it does not look like that, the latest GAN, please let me know as soon as possible so I can correct it, but I believe everybody's has been corrected at this point. Okay, so you have the 8/3 to 8/22, which for those of you who have many grants with us at this point for this particular program, that's about 2 months earlier than normal, which is good and bad. We'll talk about that later. But in general, your budget periods, you should be expecting that everything is going to revolve around those dates. Okay. Let's go to the next slide. So in the first GAN we issued to you, you would have seen GAN Action 1, which listed your year 1 award, right? Just what you got for this budget period, this first 12 months. Your GAN Action 2, this action should say NA, meaning because we didn't make any Unfortunately, no more money. It was just the budget period changes. So that's what should be reflected there. Next slide, please. Your administrative information. So for some of you, the attachment numbers that are referenced will be different. And you saw it, you see here on the slide, I've highlighted particularly attachments 4 and 7. You would have gotten attachment 4 if there's some kind of action that you've got to handle related to your indirect cost. You won't see that listed if you didn't, if there's no work to do. You would have gotten an attachment 7 if you had any kind of budget reduction. And by budget reduction, just to be clear, you proposed a certain budget. If we made any reductions to that original proposed budget, you would have an attachment 7. Okay, and those are items that I'll mention. Let's jump to the next slide real quick. That we'll talk about in our one-on-one meeting. So I won't go into too much detail today about those. And then this is just reference to the legislative citations. This is why you get the money that you do, where you're authorized. Let's go to block 10. So I mentioned those references to possible other conditions like a budget reduction or changes to IDC. In block 10, under terms and conditions, if you had one of those, you'd also see some language there that calls that out. You will also see some language possibly for some other items that I'll come back to in a moment. But again, this is just as a reference. GAN 1 would list those grant conditions. GAN 2 is just telling you, hey, this GAN is because we had to change the budget periods. So you will see 2 different sets of information, right, under block 10. Before I jump to the next slide, any questions there that I missed on the chat? Sarah, we okay? Okay. Let's jump to the next slide. Oh, actually, yeah, right there. So again, this is just highlighting. Really, there weren't many conditions for most of your grants. I mentioned already 4 and 7. For some of you, you will see another condition that is specific to you if you have multiple active Office of Indian Education grants. So if you have multiple active Office of Indian Education grants, you will have this condition on your grant. And there were certain caveats because not everybody got it. So again, that'll be something I'll discuss with you in the one-on-one and provide more explicit guidance on how to do that. Not too burdensome. It's more a matter of just ensuring internal controls, right? So that you keep each grant and its respective funding discrete, but not anything different from what you would probably be doing anyway. Next slide. So communication with OIE, which is most often me, sometimes my colleague Sarah from Synergy for technical assistance purposes. And Maria, to answer your question, the GAN would have been emailed. So if you don't have receipt of those GANs, you'll need to let me know. But those email notifications would have provided a link for you to access the GANs in G5. Just to be clear, sorry, and let me clarify that for those of you who are new. You won't get an email with an attachment. You'll get an email with a link for you to go into G5 and extract your GAN. We would never send it as an attachment. Next slide, please. So all of the communication I provide to you will be to the person on record and when and where needed with the authorized representative, but mostly to the project director. You should feel free at any point when you're sending me inquiries or needing to confirm something I know many of you have project coordinators or budget staff or other staff that need to be, clued in on stuff. You should feel free to, copy them whenever you're sending me stuff. But just know that if I get, and I'm just picking on you, Nancy, because I can see you, that if Nancy's, budget staff calls me and asks me for something, I'm just going to circle back and say, Nancy, are you good with me answering this? But I'm always going to come through you as the project director to answer any of those issues and not with anybody who is not on record. If you need to change the project director's contact information only, or for that matter, just the authorizing rep, just the contact info, email, address, phone, you can send me a quick email with corrected information. That does not need, the fancy letterhead signature document. Next slide. So if you do have a person changing out of the project director role or the authorizing rep role, we need to have these following items. So again, an email with the scanned, signed letter on letterhead from your institution, the signature of the authorizing rep requesting the project director change. And I do need all of that information: name, address, phone, fax, email, level of effort, the CV or resume of that person, and the effective start date. So those are all things that are required in our system to be able to process that change. So if you send me stuff with incorrect information or less than that, it's going to be that much longer to turn that around. I know sometimes we have authorizing reps that are changing. And so when that happens, it can be somebody else who's also considered. So let's say you had the president on there and they left and you want to change it to the CFO. It's okay if the CFO sends it on their behalf, but again, in a letter form. Okay. So if it's sort of them changing it to themselves, as long as it's a clear authorizing official, that's not a problem. Next slide. So your annual performance report. Here's what I'll tell you now. It's going to be due earlier than normal. But when I say normal, because you got the award earlier than you have typically gotten in the past, for those of you who are repeat grantees. What you should always expect is I'm going to be looking for that APR to always cover at least the first 6 months of your project. So if we say, August, September, October, November, December, January, I'm certainly not going to be asking for it before February. So it's going to be because the APR content should be inclusive through January 31st, right? So it should cover whatever those first few months of activity are. And for those of you who are new and really want to know a lot more information, I'm going to share with you shortly, if it's not already shared by Sarah in the chat box. We have our program pages on oese.ed.gov. There are plenty of recordings of past APR guidance webinars, a lot of information that you can take and get that it's not going to change very much in terms of format and expectation. But we do provide those subsequent TA events. And again, that's another opportunity in the talking circle to get clarity on any, project specific issues that might have come up. Next slide, please. So I just want to remind everybody about the GPRA measures. These are those long-term measures. And what I will say is, for those of most of you who are continuing or not continuing, but repeat grantees, meaning you have grants from older cohorts, you know that the majority of these measures are measures that really in totality can't be captured before almost the end of your grant, but that's why you have the project specific measures that really measure those milestones, right? In terms of how many you've recruited every year, how many you've retained every year. So they're going to be those measures, and I'll get to that in a minute. But the GPRA measures, the cost per teacher, cost per administrator, how many have completed their service, again, administrator, teacher, and licensure. All of those items get captured via our professional development program data collection system. So that is the system, and the data you enter, project directors and or your participants, those are the data that we rely on to capture the GPRA, just to be clear. And I just wanted to make sure, particularly for our new folks, that you're aware of what the implications of that are. And again, I'll just kind of refer to Karen, my colleague with ANLAR Westat, is our guru and is the person who will provide us with training on that system in short order. Next slide, please. So in your approved application, you had that selection criteria under project design where you laid out the number of participants to graduate each year, continuing to be recruited and ultimately employed. And so when you complete your APR every year, you're reporting on those items. And of course, for many of the first couple of years, most of those, again, might not be captured, but we'll be giving you guidance during the APR training on how to capture that data. And more importantly, this first year is really about the narrative. It's really about you explaining how far you've gotten, what challenges there are in the short term that have come up already. You know, our enemy, COVID-19, and what the implications and, you know, intersect is with the, you know, any kind of policy related consequences that impact your participants' ability or your ability to recruit, right? Or their ability to complete their coursework. So I think many of you who've been through this now with our pre-existing grants, with our 18 grants, know the type of flexibility that we're prepared to offer you to make sure that you can continue to provide the support that's needed, even if it is delayed. So I want to kind of reassure you with that expectation continuing, given where we are today, right now, you know, the continuing tenuous nature of the pandemic and the conditions you're working under. Next slide, please. So again, I mentioned ANLAR Westat, the data collection system. If you are new to that, Sarah, if you haven't already, I'll ask you to throw in the PDPDCS URL in the chat box. And I would strongly encourage you, if you are a new project director or new to this grant program, go to that site, spend some time, play around with it, look at it, see what you can garnish from there. We'll be having one-on-ones, as I mentioned, and many of you have already signed up for that. Thank you. And we can go over some of the basics then. We'll have an additional training just on that system that is mandatory. And it's mandatory of all of you because there will be some new elements in there coming this year. Next slide. There's G5. Not our enemy, not always our friend, as we all know. Let's go to the next slide. And G5, of course, is the grant system that we use to manage your account and your official grant file. Certainly, the hours are critical. There's help desk on anything technical. So I encourage you to be able to go in and check with them on items as needed. If you have trouble getting in, make sure you're contacting the help desk. Next slide, please. Again, like any other federal system at this point, there's two-factor authentication that's required. Some nice guidance. Thank you, Sarah, on making sure you always use the G5 menu and its buttons and not your browser buttons to move forward and back, or you'll get kicked out. Next slide. G5 view only access. So we've talked about this in the past. And again, if you're a new project director or new to the grant or any federal grant at Ed, you'll see that in order to see what is often for you guys as project directors, your fiscal balance, your budget, for example, you have to ask for permission to be able to have that view. So what do you have to do? You have to request and fill out more paperwork from us. And that means that you're calling our help desk. You're completing this form. We have a screenshot of it here. It's signed by your authorized rep. It must be notarized. So that's the kicker, is that's the time and effort, is it has to be notarized. But then you scan and email it to edcaps.user@ed.gov, and that will give you the ability to see what your budget staff already sees, which is your balance and being able to track. I cannot stress enough to you all that, there's this time-honored saying that, project directors, an immediate reaction when I'm asking about fiscal stuff is, well, I have a fiscal person. And I'm like, that's great, but you're the person on record. Do I need you to be the fiscal expert? Not at all. But I need you to be able to know who to go to. I also have found through experience over the last many years with each of you that it becomes really imperative to make sure that you're keeping your own ledger, you're keeping and tracking your own expenditures aside, because a lot of times there are things that G5 will not recognize because, as you guys know, you might have budget staffs that are understaffed, as many budget offices are. They're only drawing down quarterly or maybe less. And so they're not keeping up with everything, but it's pertinent that you do, so that you're aware and always able to address any issues. Because as you all know, what will likely happen for many of you over this first year will be a high balance, right? And for reasons we'll talk about in a moment. And being able to explain that is really critical. Next slide, please. So next slide. There's sort of these seminal resources that I will always come back to when I'm answering a question about your budget or about your grants management. The Uniform Guidance Regulations 2 CFR Part 200 is a key place that I will go all the time to answer questions about costs, allowability typically. So that is where you can go to if you so choose. And it's far more than you'll ever want to read, but it's there as a good reference. Next slide. Contracting. So I think you all know this, but just to reconfirm, to the extent any of you proposed contractors for any part of the work in your approved scope, when we approved your application, we did not approve your contractors. We expect that you're carrying out your contract processes in accordance with your institution's procurement policies. And again, of course, it's competitive. Full and open competition is the expectation and requirement under federal guidelines. So just be sure that you know that as you're working to hire folks and get that support that you need to carry out your work. Next slide, please. Again, more info on this to the extent feasible. You might recall in their notice inviting applications, we ask that you give Indian preference for training and employment in connection with the administration of the grant, and give to organizations and to Indian-owned economic enterprises as we define in Section 3 of the Indian Financing Act of '74. So again, that is cited in your notice inviting applications under which you applied for FY21. Next slide. Again, attachment 7, we talked about general guidance and cost principles, which really you find under uniform guidance. So, can I spend money on X? You can often look straight to uniform guidance for those answers. You can go to the next slide. Federal budget categories. Again, you all know what those are. A couple of points I want to make and ask you to consider in advance of our one-on-one meetings. So I want to be clear in your budgets that when you have, for example, I'm going to talk about induction services activities. There should be no induction services activities that are attributed to training stipend costs. All induction services related activities should be part of your direct costs, often falling under things like travel, supplies, contracts, or other, if needed. But I want to be really clear that those should not be part of the service payback obligation debt incurred by your participants. Why? Because it's after. It's not part of the training component. So I would ask you to be really sensitive to that and making sure that you're not attributing that as additional debt to your participants. Next slide. When can you change your budget? Anytime. You can change it anytime. I suspect as you look at it and you assess where you are today, many of you will want to be changing your budget. Just to be clear, there are a lot of things you can change without asking me. I've got, I need 20% more time for the project director because it turns out I've got to do XYZ too. I'm not going to use that contractor for that. I'm going to take it on. Those are things that you don't have to ask me to do. Those are direct cost changes that are completely allowable under uniform guidance. When does it matter? It matters when. There are two key pieces. These aren't the only, but they're the most important and often most relevant for you guys under this grant. One is when there's 10% of the entire budget, which frankly, to be 10% of the entire budget necessarily involves training costs, because that's the biggest part of all of your budgets. If you're trying to do something different with it, you have to ask. And then, which leads to the second bullet, which is kind of the same, which is any budgets to training costs have to be discussed with me. So this is a good example. If you look at your budget and you think, oh man, I put indirect costs there, or not indirect, I put induction services costs under that training and I'm going to need to change that. That's something I'll still want you to talk with me about as we shift it out, just so that we have it clear, it's documented, that it's a completely legitimate reason for why we're going to do that. So just bear those two items in mind as you think about making shifts. The other thing is you don't have to ask my permission, but what I do really appreciate is that if you make a number of changes, for example, over the next couple of months, as you kind of, find your grounding and figure out exactly where you are in the implementation process, then I would ask that you provide me with an updated version of your budget so that I have that on record in your official grant file. That is extremely helpful. Or if you have a question, hey, we're thinking about doing this. Do you see any kind of problem with it? Any kind of issue like that, please feel free to share. Next slide. Just some practices that will make your life a lot easier as you do your work. Keeping those GAN attachments handy. I get a lot of questions that I tell you can frankly be answered by reading those GAN attachments. We've talked about ad nauseum, as you guys know, what great bedtime reading those are. If you're an insomniac, they'll help you. But they're definitely there's plenty of important information in there that will help you in any discussions with your budget staff. And I'd encourage you, if you have questions about what you're reading, feel free to ask me. Check that G5 grant balance at least once a month. Why? Less because I'm going to come to you with questions, and frankly, more because it's important that you have an understanding of the nature and frequency of the drawdowns happening by your budget office. It gives you a real clue in, and you'll know if you are 3 months in and you see it's still a full balance, there's no drawdowns. You should be asking questions of your budget staff. Hey, why hasn't any of this been drawn down? And you should know, i.e. keeping your own ledger, we've already done all this stuff. We've already spent all this money. Why is that not taken out of there? Those are things, because when I see high balances, as you all know, 6-7 months down the line, and I ask you, you'll have an answer for that without having to worry about scrambling to meet with your budget staff. Making sure that I have your most recent budget and your most recent contact information is really key. Next slide, please. TA, so let's talk about how we want to try to be able to help you. Next slide. So again, I'm going to come back to, there are some really core documents that, you know, if you've got a binder that you maintain for this program, these are the things that should be in it. It should have your notice inviting applications for FY 2021. So why is that important? I'll give you a real quick and easy example of something that's there that's almost no place else. And that is, how much can I offer for a stipend for somebody? You know, stipend guidelines are dictated by what we write in the notice inviting applications. And you won't see that in the program regs. You won't see that in other places. You're going to see it there. So that's one just little example of things of why it's important to see that. FY20 final regulations. So for those of you, again, those of you new to the program, there were some key changes to this latest set of program regulations. The program regulations changed, as you know, because we had the Every Student Succeeds Act reauthorized in 2016. And so by default, we had to re-regulate in order to update our program regs to reflect that new authorization, that new law. And in doing so, two fundamental things changed. One is, which I think is wonderful, it offered up a new opportunity to be inclusive of native language certification for instructional purposes. The second item that changed was really much more prescriptively defining what kinds of schools and districts qualify for service payback obligation to be made. So where we had, I would say, a much broader and not well-defined, sort of threshold for what qualified in the past, it's much more clear now, meaning that the statutory language verbatim says, LEAs, i.e. districts, charter schools, BIE schools, that serve a high proportion of Indian students. You guys know, and just the short story is, we initially proposed for tribal consultation purposes, high proportion to mean 50% or more, because that seems to be a high proportion when we talk about ratio, right? But in response, you guys, the field, gave great feedback about, here's who it's going to hurt. Here's why that's not the best way and best approach. And so what was nuanced and massaged and taking your feedback, the final regs basically say, we want you to think about those LEAs that are serve a high proportion of Native students in comparison, and that high proportion is defined specific to your region, not nationally. So if you are in Oklahoma, you are only comparing the high proportion or determining high proportion based on all of the schools in Oklahoma. Same for California, only in California. So we have, let's go to the next slide too. We have the links, and I'll ask you if you want to post those again, Sarah, in the chat box, to the actual list of schools by state. That's what you guys referred to during the application process. And we've left them up in our technical assistance pages. So they are always there. We will be adding them to the PDPDCS pages for the purposes of your participants, but they can access them now through there too. So please feel free to share that with your participants so that they're aware. Why is that critical? Because we know through the data that Karen has run from the data collection system that we have a huge majority of participants who end up not teaching in the state where they're obtaining their degree. right? They go off to other states, and sometimes you have no control, of course, over where they choose to go, but they can see now if they have any inkling of going back to a different state, home state or wherever that is for them, that they know upfront what schools and districts qualify in those other places that they're considering employment. So there's more and more accountability expected on the part of the participant, because we've provided the information to give them help them make the informed decision that needs to be made. And I think as we sort of walk together through this, next phase of the journey, there's every hope that you guys as project directors are communicating with us about what additional resources and tools can help you convey that message effectively to your participants, knowing what's coming for them in terms of expectations and responsibility following their training. In addition to that TA that Synergy will offer, that Karen will offer with the PDPDCS, we also have just department resources if you just need a broader understanding of some of the guidance and the grant administration expectations and requirements that have to be maintained, typically for all federal grants, but certainly specific to ed. So there are department-wide resources like these courses on cash management, for example, that I would encourage you, if you're new to that, you're not familiar with what this means, these are good, quick references that can help give you a little bit of a primer and give you some context for what ultimately you are responsible for. Next slide, please. Same thing, this gives you a much broader overview of discretionary grants administration and what's expected, basic requirements, monitoring practices, et cetera, of the department. Next slide. You can anticipate in the coming months a few things happening. One is the needs assessment from our staff, our colleagues at Synergy. They will conduct a needs assessment based on your original approved applications and based on the TRS, the technical review form comments that came in from your peer reviewers. You guys don't have those yet. You'll be getting them as we conduct the one-on-one calls, but I will come to those calls with a quick summary of those comments to help you identify what weaknesses were shared or expressed by the peer reviewers who rated your and scored your respective applications. I mentioned the talking circles events, things like APR guidance, the PDPDCS system training. And Sarah, I'm going to turn it over to you for a second if you want to talk a little bit about communication with the OIE team, TA team.
Yeah, so the OIE TA team is here to support you all throughout the life of your grant. Anytime you have questions, we're always happy to help. And then if it's something that is really beyond the scope of the TA team, we'll always be referring you to Angela as your program officer. That's also with our talking circles. So after this meeting today, you'll receive a calendar invite for our monthly PD talking circles. They happen the third Friday of every month. So look for that in your email box this afternoon, so you can go ahead and get tied in with all that. When you're reaching out to us, we have one central email address. It's oie@seiservices.com. And when you're reaching out, it's always super helpful if you can let us know what grant program you're with. We do provide technical assistance support to all of the OIE discretionary programs. So just putting PD in there is really helpful. And then also including your PR number and your grantee name. We often get emails that are just, hey, this message is from Kelly. Well, that's not narrowing it down a ton. There hundreds of you. So it really helps if we know what grantee you're emailing about, and that helps us be able to get you an answer as soon as possible. And the last piece being, you may want to, if you have sometimes things that get blocked, because we're often sending out emails to the entire PD grantee group, it sometimes helps if you put on your safe sender list our email account there at seiservices.com. So we look forward to working with you. Look for that email this afternoon.
Thanks, Sarah. Next slide. And I can't see who's on right now. Do we still have Karen on with us? I'm not sure.
Yes, we do.
Yeah, so Karen, I'm sorry to put you on the spot. But as we go into the next couple of weeks, you will see an email invite from us on training for PDPDCS. And I kind of gave a teaser, Karen, at the beginning about a couple of, big new thing. I don't know if you want to mention that right now. I have you on mute there. There we go.
It says, hello, can you hear me now? Okay, awesome. I kept getting this message that says you can't talk. The host. So hi, yes. Yes, in a couple of weeks, we will be walking you through, and we're super excited to be introducing electronic service payback agreements. And so we'll go through all of that, and we'll have available trainings for your participants so that they can be introduced to their sides of the system early on in the process.
Thank you, Karen. Appreciate it. And thank you for being on. I know you have not been so well this week. So
thank you. Thank you.
You've been a trooper. I appreciate that. And we mentioned again, the talking circles are optional, but I'm going to leave it to your peers to share how much value they've gotten from it. I would venture to say quite a bit, just based on some of the rich discussions I know we've had in the past, but I'll let them share that. Next slide, please. And then finally, of course, in the NIA, we made reference, hey, set aside some money in your travel budget for attendance for at least one person, namely the project director. If you feel you're a project director in name only and it makes sense to have a coordinator there, that's certainly allowable. But it should be whoever's really responsible for the day-to-day management. Yes, I realize we don't know yet whether this will really be in person or if it will be virtual, as it was in this past spring for our existing grantees. So I'll just ask you to stay tuned on that. Next slide, please. And then finally, one-on-one post-award calls. So I have my work cut out for me over the next couple of weeks. I have quite a few calls already set up. So again, thank you, thank you, thank you. Everyone should have received an email from me regarding signing up for a mandatory one-on-one post-award call to review your grant project, and just to make sure I've addressed any project-specific questions or issues that might have arisen for you. So please, if you have not done so, please sign up. I don't know how many slots I frankly have left on there. So if for some reason you get there and what is left are slim pickings and you need some other options, please feel free to shoot me an email and let me know. And I'm happy to work with you to coordinate a different time that can work. Next slide, please. Oh, and I'll just say one more item on that. You can leave it on this slide. Just want to mention that if you have other staff, key staff with day-to-day responsibilities where it makes sense for them to listen in or be part of the conversation, please have them join us for that call. And I know some of you have done that. With that, I'm going to be quiet. Thank you for being so patient, and see if you all have questions. You can feel free to unmute, or you can feel free to write it in the chat box.
Currently, we don't have any questions in the chat box, but we may have some. Oh, yes. So will we get copies of the slide presentation? Yes, we'll send that out via email so everybody has a copy. On that same note, I know there's always people who are looking to see if they can get the info from the chat box. If that is you and you are wanting the info from the chat box, if you look in your chat box, it says to probably everyone, and then you see like a little square, a little smiley face, and then 3 dots. If you click those little 3 dots, it will say save chat, and that will actually save the chat as a document to your computer. So always a great way if you've been engaged in really robust chat and you want to keep that, you can do that typically in any of your Zoom meetings.
I'm going to go ahead and volunteer some information at the risk of getting a slew of questions after this, but let me just mention a couple of things. As you know, when you applied, most of you asked, when would we expect to start? And we said, probably July, late July. So we weren't too far off from there. I also know that this is crunch time in terms of registration and enrollment and matriculation for your respective students, whether they're part of this grant project or not. And for some of you, you may feel that maybe you aren't going to get the recruited number in time. Maybe you feel you aren't going to get any recruits in time. Those are things that you should feel prepared to talk with me about, and we can work through. I'll say a couple of things about that. One is you have a proposed project where you have sort of these set measures, these milestones that we talked about, project-specific milestones annually. Our expectation is you're doing your best to meet those, whether it's if you're falling behind, i.e., we gave you a grant on August 3rd, and you might tell me they were supposed to have been enrolled by July 27th. Well, then that's what it is. And we're going to work toward, well, then what's the next realistic milestone? And you're going to provide that justification about, sort of your schedule and its alignment or not to ours. So I want to say that now, just so people don't freak out that you're immediately going to get, funds cut, etc. I mean, I think we've been through this process with most of you enough to know that you're going to certainly be given a degree of latitude to ensure. And because this grant is brand new, we know you have opportunity, if you will, to quote unquote catch that up, right? To get to those project measures that you're hoping to achieve, those targets. So just know that there's certainly that. What matters to me is that you're communicating and that you are sharing sort of where those challenges lie, and that you're being very clear and as detailed as you can about the circumstances. But, again, with the expectation that come February, when an APR is due, you're going to have something to write about, whatever that is. So everything that you can do in the meantime is what you should be trying to do in the meantime, whether that's recruitment efforts, et cetera. I just want to kind of throw that out there now. So there is inevitably some degree of flexibility with the understanding that we see a level of effort being displayed, that you're going to try to do what you can to catch up to meet your respective targets you set for your grant. Any question about that?
We didn't have a question yet on that, but we did have a question about if a grantee has actually received more than one award, do they need to sign up for a one-on-one call for each award, or can they just knock it out in one?
Krista, thank you so much for asking that question. I hate hearing myself over and over again. So I would love it if we just kept it to one call and just talked about both grants. And I know that there are 4 grantees that have both administrator and training grants in this cohort. So yeah, there's every expectation. We should be able to fit what we need to in the 1-hour call. And if there's something extenuating, that we can set up additional time if we run out, but I think we should be fine with the hour. And actually that goes for all of you, that in general, I don't expect that these calls are going to take a full hour. I just left that in the event we have questions and we need to talk through anything. So any other questions? See, Julie and Adana, this cohort is perfect. They know exactly what needs to be done. So we're good.
Great things.
So again, just a reminder, if you haven't signed up for the one-on-one, please do so as soon as possible, so that we can get that started. And I hope you will join us for the August 20 talking circles. And please look out for an email from us regarding the data collection system training. For those of you who are new to the DCS, it's imperative that you're there because there are a lot of details, a lot of steps. If you have in mind a second individual who will support you in, populating the data of that system, i.e., entering all the data for your participants. If there's somebody different who's doing that, we call them the secondary user. There can be two, and they should both be part of that event. So that should be you and whoever that second person is. So please be sure to invite them and feel free to forward that email, the invite to them so that they can join as well. With that, I'll stay on, but you all, I hope I've given you at least about 20 minutes back. Enjoy your weekend and congratulations again. It's really wonderful to see all of your faces. I hope at some point it gets to be in person again. But thank you. And thanks for all the work that you do. Take care.